Hi, good morning. Oh, working. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about documentary filmmaking, actually a project that I'm working on right now. But it's going to be pretty short because the truth is I'm not actually a documentary filmmaker. I'm working on my first film, and I can tell you everything I know about filmmaking. Well, this slide is almost accurate as it is if it comes up. There we go. Okay. That slide is almost accurate as it is. But I'll add a little bit to it just so this is interesting. There's really only a few things that I was thinking about when I started the project, and that was I needed to have a story to tell, I needed a camera, I had to have something to edit it with, and I needed to have some people watch it when I was done. Actually, the only thing I had was a camera and a computer. I had an idea for a story, but I didn't actually know if there was one. So I'll back up and tell you how this started. When I was about 7 years old or so, I went through the typical areas of interest that 7-year-old boys do. I was interested in sharks and dinosaurs. And at some point, snakes caught my attention. And that interest kind of stuck with me through my whole life. So I grew up watching Wild Kingdom and watching David Attenborough and all these wonderful documentary filmmakers. And then watched over the years as the quality of that programming went down. And once Steve Irwin passed away, there was an era of wildlife programming that kind of died with him. And that was replaced with very sensationalist, exaggerated filmmaking. So the things that you see on things like Animal Planet now, it's absolutely a disaster. So I was very, very interested in telling a story that wasn't about sensationalism. It wasn't about everything, about how dangerous these animals can be. But it was about the people who work with them for real. When you don't have a host, the lights are turned off, people who actually make their living with these animals day in and day out. And I thought that there was probably a pretty interesting story there. Didn't know what the story was, but it turned out that there was one. And the end product of this exercise is a documentary film called The Venom Interviews. It's a collection of interviews with people who deal with these animals day in and day out. And it turned out that there is a story there, which I'll get to as we go through. I'm going to show you a short clip from the film, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some things I learned in the process.
As doctors go, I'm lucky because my patients tell cooler stories than other doctors. One of the big reasons to be in my field is you get to ask everybody, how on earth did you get snake bitten? Then, there, by that.
Obviously there's not people dropping right and left from colubrid bites in general, or we'd know a lot more about them.
They think, well, I got it from a reputable dealer, it's going to be fine, and the next thing you know, you got OPV through your colony and they're all dead.
Big, mean, horrible snake, no redeeming factors, except for the fact that it saved more lives than it's taken.
And they'll say to me, do you realize that in Africa, the cost of a single course of antivenom could exceed the annual income of the worker? And my answer is, same here.
Younger snakes are believed by many people to be more dangerous than the adults. There's absolutely no truth to that.
A lot of the people who work with these creatures are not exactly what you would characterize as normal.
I must have been the creepiest second grader on the planet. I could become a sociopath or a medical toxicologist.
It's a snake of particular interest because the antivenom does not neutralize the venom from the southern Pacific rattlesnake. People thought that they were predominantly all hemorrhagic. Well, now we know that that's not the case.
I had a guy in Florida that wanted me to venomize a cobra for him so he could take it down to the beach and show the girls. I said, no, thank you.
I'm 47 years old. I've been doing this since I was a kid, and I have never been bit.
I have gotten no recognition or acknowledgement or anything for those thousands of good handlings. Yet I'm famous because I screwed up once.
There's some story there that's gonna be interesting.
All right, so that's a little preview of the nature of the film, some of the topics that are discussed. I'm not going to talk a lot more about the film itself, but I do want to talk about some of the things that I learned in the process of making it, both about the work that they do and about how they came to do the work. Now, usually we can't get very far in a discussion like this, but where somebody asks, well, isn't this dangerous? And the answer is, well, yeah, occasionally it is dangerous, depending on what you do. People, for example, who work in venom laboratories, there's not one of them, well, there's only 3 or 4 of them in the country, but the people that do that kind of work, the fewest number of bites any of those guys have had is 6 or 7 or so, and some of those are pretty serious bites. One friend of mine has been bitten by 3 out of 4 species of mambas. One's been bitten in the face by an eastern diamondback rattlesnake. So there are times when it becomes more interesting than you'd want it to be. But one thing that's worth talking about is that there's a difference between being venomous and being dangerous. I think he's going to help me out by himself. Okay. So this is Musa. Musa is a musarana from South America. Now, I got him out of the bag with a hook, mostly because I didn't want to surprise him with my hands. But he's a good example of a snake that is technically venomous. He does produce a venom, but he's not dangerous. And the reason he's not dangerous is actually pretty interesting. It's not because he's not willing to bite me. He could, he never has, but he certainly could. It is not because he's a rear-fanged snake and he has very small fangs, which he does, they're almost too small to see. But it's because the venom that he produces is very specific to his prey. He eats mostly other snakes. So if you're another snake, you're in bad shape. Their venom has very little effect on people, has very little effect on mammals for that matter. So he's not a dangerous snake to people. He's apparently dangerous to audio, though. All right. Let's get him back in the bag. All right. Thank you. Okay. Now, another topic that comes up all the time is, what is the most dangerous snake you work with? What is the most dangerous snake in the world? And we have, as humans, we have a kind of a morbid curiosity with things that will kill us. You know, what things can kill us the best, or what things can kill us the fastest, or what can kill us in the most dramatic ways? It turns out that that's a very difficult question. It's actually almost impossible to answer. But it does lead to some very interesting questions. So, for example, you can look at simple toxicity. Toxicity is measured in mice with a metric they call an LD50. It's a lethal dose that'll kill 50% of the population. And the lower a venom's LD50, the more toxic it is. You can think of an LD50, or you can think of the milligrams per kilogram as parts per million. So if you weigh about 50 kilograms, you can think of about a quarter of a Tylenol as 1 milligram per kilogram of your body weight. So if a venom had an LD50 of 1 milligram per kilogram, that would be enough to be lethal. So we look at just simple toxicity. An inland taipan from Australia has the most toxic venom of any land snake. One good-sized taipan would be enough to have everybody in this room cold by dinner time. But does that make it a very dangerous snake? Well, how many fatalities have come from inland taipans? None. There's no recorded deaths from inland taipans. Why is that? Well, they live out in the middle of nowhere in Australia, and the only people who ever get bitten by them are people who work with them, and the people that work with them are usually very well prepared to deal with a bite. Another thing that you have to look at is the amount of venom a snake produces. Now, this is actually very interesting. On the left there you see a yellow jacket wasp. Its venom is actually more potent than a gaboon viper down below. The honeybees, nobody's afraid of honeybees. Honeybees have venom that is more toxic than this Mexican West Coast rattlesnake. And the one on my right is a favorite, a harvester ant. You're going to say that, no, a harvester ant can't be more toxic than a black mamba. A black mamba wishes it had harvester ant venom. The ant is about 3 times as toxic as the mamba. But in all of those cases, they produce very, very tiny amounts. So to look at dangerousness, at best, you'd have to look at both the toxicity of the venom and how much you get. But that by itself still doesn't tell you much about how dangerous a snake is to the public. There's a snake that kills the most people in the world that most people have never heard of. It's a little saw-scale viper. You can see how tiny it is compared to the person's thumb that's holding it. These bite hundreds of thousands of people a year and kill tens of thousands of people a year. Nobody's ever heard of it. Why is that? Well, it has a venom it's moderately toxic to mice. It happens that it is horrendously toxic to humans. They're prolific, they breed a lot, there's lots of them around, and they bite a lot of people in areas of the world that have little or no medical care. That makes them a very dangerous animal. So if they're that dangerous, why would anybody want to do this for a living? What possible value could there be? Well, let me tell you a story. I'll try to illustrate how these are valuable. My friend Mike was working with a collection of snakes called the stiletto snake, which is the one on the right. For the purpose of these pictures, the snake was knocked out. That's how difficult the snake is to work with. The little curvy thing that you see along the snake's head, that's its venom gland. It extends about 4 inches down its neck. It's enormous. This snake, you can see it has a very small head. The gland goes all the way down its neck. That's not the worst part of it. For its size, it has some of the largest fangs of any snake in the world. They're almost so big they hardly fit in the snake's mouth. But that's not the worst part of it. The fangs don't swing out forward like most vipers do. They actually swing out the sides of its mouth, which means you can't hold it. You can't grab it behind the head like you would with most snakes, because it'll just twist its head and stick you. That's not the worst part of it. The worst part is that even with all those other factors, there's no antivenom for this snake. Now, this snake has a very interesting toxin called seraphotoxin, which is similar to endothelin it's a hormone your body produces. It's a vasoconstrictor that helps regulate blood pressure, among other things. Well, seraphotoxin does much the same thing, but in a very unbalanced way. It takes a very tiny amount of this to keep your body in balance. If you get a lot of it, you're in big trouble. So when Mike was collecting venom samples, he got stuck 3 times in his left thumb. And it started out, as most snake bites do, as a little bruising and puncture wound. And within about 3 or 4 hours, his thumb looked like this. This is simply the result of that biochemistry in that part of his body being thrown out of balance. So if you misuse your thumb, you don't get to keep it. He did end up losing the end of his thumb. And this is what's left of it. There's a whole lot more to this story that I don't have time to go into, but it's pretty interesting. He has a pretty good humor about it. This is the Thanksgiving turkeys that he draws now. So what could possibly be good about this? I told you I was going to try to make a case that venom is good for you, can be good for you. Well, it turns out that those things that venoms can do, there's different toxins that are very targeted. It's not a freight train full of battery acid going through your body. It's actually doing some very specific things. And it turns out that some of those things it does are very useful. For example, if any of your parents or grandparents are on blood pressure medication, they probably owe the fact that they're alive today to this awful little snake in South America called a jararaca. It's a lancehead viper. Happens to produce a peptide in its venom that's good for controlling blood pressure. There's a drug called Byetta, which was identified as a hormone called exenatide in Gila monster venom. There's ones that take care of blood clotting. Black mambas and cobras have components that deal with pain. Copperhead venom is being researched because it attacks cancer cells preferentially, which is a good thing. And of course, antivenom. Antivenom can't be made without snake venom. All the antivenom in the world is made with snake venom now. Antivenom is a pretty interesting drug because of how it's produced. They extract venom from snakes, inject it into an animal. In the US, we use sheep. Most countries use horses, but there's other things you can use, camels, rabbits, sharks, chickens, there's all kinds of things you can use. And when the venom is introduced into those animals, it produces an immune response. Your body produces antibodies to it. Those antibodies are then injected into a patient who's bitten by the same kind of snake that the antibodies were raised to. Now, those antibodies are very specific. They only work for the species that they were raised against. And venom varies not only between species, but geographically. So the venom that you would see in vipers across Africa and India is different from the little island that I'm pointing to there, the island of Sri Lanka. The cobras and mambas and kraits and Russell's vipers there, those are all snakes that exist in India. But the Indian antivenom doesn't work in Sri Lanka. They're separated geographically and they have different venom. So there's a group called Animal Venom Research International who is coordinating an effort between Sri Lanka and the Institute of Clodomiro Picado in Costa Rica, produces some of the best antivenom in the world, to get them self-sufficient. They lose about 2,000 people a year, about 40,000 people a year being bitten, and they will become self-sufficient in their ability to produce their own antivenom. Now, in the US, we have a bit of a crisis in antivenom, a looming crisis, in that a lot of the snakes that we use for producing antivenom are being slaughtered in rattlesnake roundups. Now, you wouldn't imagine taking a dog and sewing its mouth shut. That is exactly what they do in roundups for exhibition and so forth. The snakes are killed, and it's getting to the point now, for the first time, we have a shortage of venom from rattlesnakes for antivenom production. So let me wrap up with a question that Leslie asked me. Leslie was the creepiest second grader on the planet. She asked me, well, the people who have managed to make a living in this business, what separates them from people who are just casually interested, or people who are, they're curious about snakes? And it turned out that I didn't have a good answer for that. So I went back and I asked everybody else that I interviewed. And the consistent factor was that all of the people who have made a living in it are fanatical about it. They're obsessive, unbelievably passionate about working with these animals and the work that they do. And I think that carries through to all of the professions that you might be considering. And what is interesting about this is all of these people, because of their obsession, because of their passion, manage to make a living at something that is really, really difficult to do. Thank you very much.